The clatter of a silver fork against a porcelain plate was the only sound that dared to break the spell of Le Ciel Étoilé. Then came the voice, sharp and cold as a shard of ice, slicing through the hushed reverence of the dining room. "You!" Clara Maeve, all of 20 years old, froze mid-reach for a water glass. The word was not a request, it was a verdict. She turned slowly, her tray balanced precariously on one hand. At the most coveted table by the panoramic window, a woman was rising to her feet. Eleanor Vance. Her name was a whisper of old money and ruthless power in the city's highest circles. Her face, a mask of sculpted indignation, was fixed on Clara. "My earring," Mrs. Vance announced, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, to curdle the expensive wine in every glass. "It's gone, the Star of Asta. It was on my ear not 10 minutes ago." Clara's heart gave a painful lurch. She felt the sudden, prickling heat of 100 pairs of eyes turning toward her. "Ma'am, I haven't seen—" "Don't lie to me, girl." Eleanor Vance's hand shot out, not to touch, but to point, her finger a weapon. "You were just here, clearing the bread plates." You leaned in close. Too close. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Clara could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. The silent, collective judgment of the wealthy siding with their own. She was just a girl in a black uniform, her hair pulled back in a simple, severe bun, her existence defined by her ability to remain invisible. And now, she was the most visible person in the world. "I would never," Clara whispered, the words feeling thin and useless against the woman's granite certainty. "Oh, of course you wouldn't," Mrs. Vance sneered, a cruel twist to her perfectly painted lips. "You people never do you? You just acquire things. You think because we have so much, we won't notice one little thing missing. A diamond worth more than the building you live in. You people." The phrase landed like a physical blow, knocking the air from Clara's lungs. Mr. Dubois, the restaurant's manager, scurried over, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Mrs. Vance, please, I am certain there is a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding, Jean-Pierre, is that you hired a thief," she snapped, not taking her eyes off Clara. "Search her. Search her uniform. Her pockets. Now." Clara stood paralyzed, a specimen under a microscope. Her gaze flickered across the room, past the judgmental stares, the whispers, the phones already being discreetly raised. Her eyes landed, for a desperate second, on the man at table 7, the quiet one in the corner she had been serving all night. He was a regular, though no one seemed to know his name. He always sat alone, dressed in unassuming, dark suits that were far more expensive than they looked. He never made small talk, but he had kind eyes. Or so she had thought. Now, those eyes were watching her, unreadable, his expression a careful blank. He made no move to help, no gesture of support. He just watched, a silent observer to her public execution. Shame, hot and acidic, rose in her throat. Her father, a watchmaker who had taught her the value of integrity above all else, had always said, "Dignity is the only thing they can't take from you unless you give it away." She was trying so hard not to give it away, but her hands were trembling, her resolve crumbling under the weight of so many hostile stares. "I won't be searched like a criminal," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. "I didn't do anything." Mrs. Vance let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Oh, she has spirit. How quaint." She turned to the manager, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Jean-Pierre, call the police. Have this creature arrested. If my earring isn't found on her person, I will have this entire restaurant dismantled piece by piece for its incompetence." The manager flinched as if struck. He looked at Clara, his eyes pleading, then hardening with resignation. He had made his choice. It was the choice of survival. "Miss Maeve," he said, his voice void of all warmth. "Please cooperate. Empty your pockets." Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. The man at table 7, the one with the supposedly kind eyes, slowly lifted his wine glass to his lips, his gaze still fixed on her. He wasn't her savior. He was just another spectator, waiting for the show to end. The trap had been sprung, and she was the only one caught in its teeth. Clara had first noticed the man at table 7 3 months ago. He wasn't like the other patrons of Le Ciel Étoilé. They came to be seen, to perform their wealth with loud laughter and grand gestures. He came to be invisible, much like her. He'd request the same corner table, shielded by a large marble pillar, and read a book, a real paper and ink book, until his food arrived. Her fascination with him was academic, a quiet exercise for her overactive mind. She was an art history student, or at least she would be. Every dollar from this job, every humiliatingly small tip from people who spent more on an appetizer than she made in a week, was being funneled into a savings account for tuition. Her dream was to be a conservator, to work with her hands, to find the truth hidden beneath layers of varnish and time. It was a trade that required an almost obsessive attention to detail, a skill her father had honed in her since she was a child. "Look closer, Clara," he'd say, holding a complex watch movement under a loupe. "The truth is always in the smallest parts, the scratch on a gear, the wear on a spring. People lie. Metal doesn't." So she observed. The man at table 7 wore a Patek Philippe Calatrava, a model of sublime understatement, but she noticed the tiny, almost invisible scratches on the bezel and the subtle fraying on the edge of its leather strap. It wasn't a trophy, it was a companion, worn daily for years. He held his fork in the European style, a habit of either extensive travel or a privileged upbringing. And sometimes she caught a faint, almost imperceptible scent on him. Not cologne, but something like turpentine and old linen, the smell of an artist's studio. Tonight he had seemed different, more present. His book lay unopened on the table. He had watched her as she worked, his gaze not intrusive, but thoughtful. When she'd refilled his water, their fingers had brushed for a fleeting moment. A spark of something, static, warmth, she wasn't sure, had surprised them both. He'd pulled his hand back quickly, his mask of stoicism slipping for a half-second to reveal something softer, more vulnerable. Now, that same man, Julian Croft, though she didn't know his name yet, watched as her world imploded. He saw the manager, Jean-Pierre, gesture for 2 of the larger busboys to approach Clara. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also a core of defiance that intrigued him. Julian had built an empire on reading people, on seeing past the facade to the foundations beneath. He'd retreated from the world years ago, after a brutal betrayal had taught him that trust was a currency he could no longer afford to spend. He came to this restaurant because it was quiet, and no one bothered him. He watched people like a biologist studying a foreign species, detached and analytical. He watched Eleanor Vance, a woman he knew from a past life of charity galas and corporate warfare. He knew her for what she was, a predator who enjoyed the sport of crushing those she deemed beneath her. He saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes, an emotion too potent for a simple case of misplaced jewelry. This felt personal. It felt rehearsed. He saw Clara. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, not of guilt, but of rage and fear. He saw the way she held her chin up, even as her eyes welled with tears. He saw her glance at him, a flicker of desperate hope that died almost instantly when he did nothing. And in that moment, Something shifted in him. The detached observer felt a pang of something. Responsibility? Shame? He wasn't sure. He'd built walls around his heart for a reason. Getting involved was messy, and it never ended well. "Empty your pockets, Clara," Jean-Pierre repeated, his voice strained. "Do it now, or we will hold you until the police arrive." Clara took a shaky breath. She looked at the faces around her. Gleeful, indifferent, pitiless. She thought of her grandmother waiting at home, the woman who had raised her on stories of standing firm in the face of injustice. "Fear not," her grandmother would quote from her worn Bible, "for I am with you." Right now, she felt terrifyingly alone. Slowly she reached into the small pocket of her apron. She pulled out its contents and placed them on the edge of a nearby service table. A pen, a small notepad, a tube of lip balm, a folded $5 bill, her only tip of the night so far. "The other pockets," Mrs. Vance commanded, her voice dripping with venom. Clara's uniform had 2 deeper pockets at the hip. Her hands shook as she reached into the first, then the second. They were empty. She held them inside out to prove it. A collective, disappointed sigh seemed to ripple through the room. The show wasn't over, but the first act was a dud. Mrs. Vance's face tightened. This wasn't going according to her script. She's hidden it, in her shoes, her hair, or she passed it to an accomplice. She gestured wildly. "I want her detained." Jean-Pierre, now fully committed to his role as executioner, nodded grimly. "Marco Sebastian, take her to my office. Don't let her out of your sight." The 2 large men moved toward her. Clara took an involuntary step back, her eyes wide with panic. This couldn't be happening. Her dreams of college, her reputation, her entire future was about to be shattered over a lie. She looked one last time at the man at table 7. His face was no longer blank. It was a thundercloud of conflict. He was leaning forward slightly, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his table. He was going to do something. He had to. But he didn't. He just watched as the 2 men cornered her, their large frames blocking her from the rest of the room. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on her, stealing her breath. She closed her eyes, bracing for the touch of their hands on her arms. The pressure of the busboys' hands on her upper arms was firm, impersonal, and utterly degrading. They were steering her away from the dining room, through the swinging doors into the chaotic heat of the kitchen. The sounds of the restaurant changed instantly from a low, judgmental murmur to the clang of pans and the hiss of the grill. The kitchen staff fell silent as she was marched past, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. They knew the rules. An accusation from a patron like Eleanor Vance was a death sentence. They pushed her into Jean-Pierre's cramped, windowless office and closed the door. The air was stale, smelling of old cigars and desperation. Marco stood by the door, arms crossed, a human barricade. Sebastian stood over her, his expression apologetic but firm. "Just wait here," he said, his voice low. "The manager is calling the police. It's better if you just cooperate." Cooperate with her own destruction? Clara sank into the worn leather chair behind the manager's desk, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her mind raced, replaying the last 10 minutes in a horrifying loop. The pointing finger, the sneer. "You people." The silent, watching eyes of the man at table 7. Why hadn't he said anything? He had seen her all night. He had to know she hadn't gone near Mrs. Vance with any intent other than to serve her. A cold dread began to seep into her bones. This wasn't a mistake. It was an attack. Mrs. Vance's accusation was too quick, too confident. It was as if she had been waiting for the opportunity. But why? Why her? A nobody waitress. It made no sense. Unless the earring wasn't missing at all, her father's voice echoed in her head. Look closer, Clara. The truth is always in the smallest parts. She closed her eyes, forcing her panicked brain to work, to observe. She visualized the scene again. Mrs. Vance at her table. The woman was wearing a black, sequined dress. The star of Aster was a large, pear-shaped diamond dangling from a platinum stud. It was heavy. An earring that large and valuable would have a special backing, a secure one, not a simple butterfly clasp. It wouldn't just fall off. She remembered clearing the bread plates. Mrs. Vance had been on her phone, laughing at something, her head tilted to the side, her left hand toying with the earring. Her left hand. The earring was on her right ear. Clara remembered because the light from the window had caught the facets of the diamond, sending a brief, blinding rainbow across the table. She had leaned in to take the plate, saying, "Excuse me, ma'am." Mrs. Vance had waved her away dismissively with her right hand, her fingers brushing against her own earlobe. Could she have? No, that was insane. Why would a woman frame a waitress for stealing an earring she still possessed? It was illogical. It was monstrous. And yet, the look in Eleanor Vance's eyes, that was the look of a hunter, not a victim. The office door opened, and Jean-Pierre entered, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, officer. We have her detained in my office. She is not being cooperative." He hung up and glared at Clara. "The police will be here in 5 minutes. This is your last chance to make this easy on yourself. Tell us where the earring is." "I don't have it," Clara said, her voice steadier now. An idea, fragile and terrifying, was beginning to form. "Because she never lost it." Jean-Pierre scoffed. "Do you hear yourself? You are accusing Mrs. Eleanor Vance of lying. A woman who is a patron of the arts, a benefactor to this city, our most important client." "I'm accusing her of what I saw," Clara said, standing up. The motion was so abrupt, it made the manager take a step back. She was toying with it. She touched her ear just as I leaned in. I think she unclasped it herself. "That's absurd," he hissed. "Why would she do that?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "But I know I didn't take it." Her desperate theory was met with a look of withering contempt. To Jean-Pierre, the world was simple. The rich were right, and the staff were disposable. Her word meant nothing. Less than nothing. Meanwhile, back in the dining room, Julian Croft sat motionless. He had watched them take her away. He had seen the fear and defiance warring in her eyes. He should have let it go. It wasn't his problem. He had spent a decade avoiding other people's problems. But her father's words, which he had overheard her whisper to herself one quiet evening when she thought no one was listening. "Dignity is the only thing they can't take from you," echoed in his mind. He was watching them take hers. And then there were the details, the small parts. Julian, like Clara, was an observer. He'd noticed Eleanor's strange agitation all evening. He'd noticed the way she had watched the girl, Clara, with an unnerving focus long before the alleged theft. And he'd noticed something else, something that had pricked at the edge of his consciousness. When Eleanor had stood up to make her grand accusation, she had placed both hands flat on the table for dramatic effect. Her clutch, a small beaded designer bag, sat beside her plate. As she had pushed herself up, the heel of her right hand had pressed down on the corner of the clutch. He had seen the slight indentation. He looked over at Eleanor's table now. She was sipping champagne, basking in the sympathetic murmurs of the surrounding tables, performing the role of the violated aristocrat. Her clutch was still there. Slowly, deliberately, Julian folded his napkin and placed it on the table. He stood up. He was a tall man, and though his suits were unassuming, he had an aura of quiet authority that had commanded boardrooms and dismantled corporations. As he began to walk toward Eleanor's table, a hush fell over that section of the dining room. People didn't approach Eleanor Vance. They were summoned. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. Eleanor Vance looked up, her performance faltering. A flicker of genuine shock and perhaps fear crossed her face. Julian Croft, I had no idea you were here." "I value my privacy," he said, his eyes cold. "Something I imagine is about to become a very precious commodity for you." Her face paled slightly. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Julian said, his gaze dropping to the small, beaded clutch on her table. "You were so busy orchestrating this little drama, you got sloppy. The small parts, Eleanor, they always trip you up." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Every person at the surrounding tables was leaning in, straining to hear. "Your earring," Julian continued, his voice dangerously soft. "You say the girl took it. A master thief, apparently. Snatched it from your ear without you feeling a thing. Impressive." He paused. "But I have a different theory. I think you took it off yourself, and in your haste to create a scene, you did something careless." He reached out, not touching the clutch, but pointing a long finger at it. "You pressed down on your bag when you stood up. A bag, I might add, that has a magnetic clasp. A very strong one, if I recall the design. Strong enough, perhaps, to attract a small piece of platinum." Eleanor's eyes widened in panic. She instinctively reached for the clutch, but Julian was quicker. He didn't grab it. He simply tapped the table beside it, a sharp rap of his knuckles. "Jean-Pierre!" he called out, his voice now ringing with command. The manager, who had just emerged from the kitchen, froze in his tracks, his face ashen, as he recognized the man from table 7. It was Julian Croft, the Julian Croft, the reclusive billionaire whose investments kept half the city afloat. "Mr. Croft, sir," Jean-Pierre stammered. "Bring the girl back out here," Julian ordered. "And then you are going to open Mrs. Vance's clutch, very, very carefully." Eleanor shot to her feet. "You can't. That's my private property. This is an outrage." "No, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout. "An outrage is trying to ruin a young woman's life for sport. An outrage is what is about to happen to your reputation when the world finds out what you did here tonight." The entire restaurant was silent, a tableau of shock and anticipation. The police were 5 minutes away. Clara was locked in an office, her future hanging by a thread. And Julian Croft, the man who never got involved, had just declared war in the middle of Le Ciel Étoilé. The swinging doors of the kitchen burst open. Jean-Pierre, his face the color of spoiled milk, practically ran to Clara's side. Marco and Sebastian, the 2 bus boys, looked on in confusion. "Come with me," the manager choked out, grabbing Clara's arm. His grip was no longer forceful, but trembling, desperate. "What's happening?" Clara asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Croft," he whispered, as if the name itself were a prayer or a curse. "He's involved." He pulled her back into the dining room. The scene was frozen, a moment of high drama captured in amber. Every patron was on their feet or leaning over their chairs, their attention fixed on the confrontation between Eleanor Vance and the quiet man from table 7. Eleanor stood rigid, her face a mask of fury and trapped panic. Julian Croft was calm, implacable, a pillar of quiet certainty. As Clara stepped into the room, a collective gasp went through the crowd. Her eyes met Julian's. He gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a gesture of reassurance. It was one of confirmation. I see you. I believe you. For the first time all night, Clara felt a surge of strength that had nothing to do with fear or defiance. It was hope. Mrs. Vance, Julian said, his voice still deceptively mild. The police are on their way. They will, of course, need to examine all the evidence, including your personal effects, or you could save us all the time and open your bag now. Eleanor's eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, an escape route. She found none. She was surrounded by the very people whose opinions she cultivated and controlled, and they were all watching her, their expressions shifting from sympathy to suspicion. This is preposterous, she spat, clutching her bag to her chest. He's delirious, and you're all just going to stand here and let him harass me? But her protest was met with silence. Julian Croft's word, even after years of public absence, carried more weight than her manufactured outrage. "Open the bag, Eleanor," he repeated. It was no longer a suggestion. It was in that moment that Clara's own power, the power of her unique sight, returned to her. Her mind, now clear of panic, started working again. Look closer. She wasn't looking at the bag. She was looking at Eleanor. The woman's left hand was clutching the beaded fabric of the clutch, but her right hand was clenched into a tight fist at her side, so tight her knuckles were white. Why? Clara took a step forward. "Wait," she said. Her voice was small, but in the dead silence of the room it was as loud as a bell. Everyone turned to her. Julian Croft raised an eyebrow, surprised. "It's not in the bag," Clara said, her gaze locked on Eleanor's clenched fist. The memory clicked into place. Eleanor, waving her away from the table with her right hand, her fingers brushing her earlobe. She hadn't just touched the earring, she had cupped it. A practiced, subtle movement. A sleight of hand. "It's in her hand," Clara stated, pointing. "Her right hand. She's been holding it this entire time." The accusation was so bold, so direct, it stunned the room. Eleanor Vance's head snapped toward Clara, her eyes blazing with pure hatred. "You insolent little witch!" "Open your hand, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice now hard as steel. He had seen it too, the moment Clara pointed it out. The unnaturally tight fist, the desperate tension in her arm. Eleanor began to back away. "I won't be assaulted, I'm leaving." But Jean-Pierre, seeing his entire career and the restaurant's reputation about to be saved, found a sudden spine. He moved to block her path. "Madame Vance, I think it would be best for everyone if you just showed us your hand." Cornered, Eleanor did the unthinkable. With a wild cry of fury, she turned and hurled the clutch at Julian's head. He ducked easily, the bag sailing past him and hitting the floor with a soft thud. In that split second of distraction, she made a run for the main entrance. But she didn't get far. As she shoved past a table, her clenched fist accidentally struck a heavy silver water pitcher. The impact forced her fingers open. Something small and glittering flew from her palm, arcing through the air in a perfect, sparkling trajectory. It landed on the pristine white tablecloth of a nearby table with a soft, almost inaudible tink. Silence. Every eye in the room followed the object. There, in the center of the white cloth, lay the Star of Asta, its facets catching the light, blazing like a tiny, malevolent sun. A star of shame. The truth was out. Not because of a billionaire's power, but because a waitress had dared to look closer. Eleanor Vance froze, her back to the room, her escape cut off. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. The silence that followed was more damning than any shout, more humiliating than any accusation. It was the sound of her world collapsing. Then, the main doors of the restaurant swung open, and 2 uniformed police officers walked in, their faces grim. "We had a call about a theft?" the first officer said, his voice booming in the funereal quiet. Jean-Pierre, his face a storm. The silence that followed the tink of the falling diamond was a physical thing, a vacuum that sucked the air and sound from the room. It was more profound than the hush of reverence that had preceded the chaos, deeper than the grave. In that void, Clara Maeve felt herself split in 2. One self was a girl made of trembling limbs and a heart that beat like a trapped bird against her ribs. The other was an observer, cold and distant, watching the tableau as if it were a poorly executed chiaroscuro painting. She saw the star of Asta, a malevolent spark on the pristine linen. She saw Eleanor Vance, a statue of silks and sequins, her back a testament to shattered pride. She saw the faces of the other diners, their expressions a grotesque gallery of shock, schadenfreude, and dawning, delicious comprehension. And she saw Julian Croft, who was not looking at Eleanor or the diamond, but at her, his gaze an unreadable cipher of concern and calculation. The spell was broken by the mundane, the heavy tread of police boots on marble. "We had a call about a theft?" The officer's voice was a cudgel, shattering the fragile silence. Jean-Pierre, a man remade by terror and then by deliverance, pointed a quivering finger, not at Clara, but at the rigid figure of Eleanor Vance. "Yes, officer," he managed, his voice a reedy thing, "but it seems our thief has been found." The aftermath was not a blur. It was a series of excruciatingly sharp, hyper-realistic moments, each one etched into Clara's memory with the precision of a diamond scribe. She remembered the soft, defeated slump of Eleanor's shoulders as an officer spoke to her in low, professional tones. There was no shouting, no dramatic arrest, just the quiet, methodical dismantling of a queen on her own chessboard. Clara watched as Eleanor was led away, not in handcuffs, but wrapped in a shroud of public ignominy, so complete it felt more binding than steel. She did not look at Clara. To look at her would be to acknowledge her existence as anything more than a prop, and even in ruin, Eleanor Vance would not grant her that. Clara gave her statement standing near the panoramic window, the city lights a smear of indifferent jewels below. Julian Croft stood a few feet away, a silent sentinel, whose presence altered the room's gravity, ensuring the officers treated her not as staff, but as a witness, a victim. He did not speak for her. He did not have to. His stillness was a language of power they all understood. When she finished, her voice hoarse, the younger officer gave a small, respectful nod. "You have a good eye, miss," he said, the words a simple, clean truth in a room thick with lies. "You saw what was there, not what you were supposed to see." When the last of the police had gone and the remaining staff began the funereal task of clearing the wreckage of the evening, Julian finally turned to her. The air between them crackled with the energy of 1,000 unspoken questions. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was so simple, so inadequate, that it was almost comical. Clara looked at her hands. They were steady now. She was no longer the trembling girl. The cold observer had taken over. "I don't know what I am," she answered, the honesty of it surprising them both. "I feel hollowed out, like someone reached inside me and scooped everything out." "That's the feeling of being used as a weapon," he said, his voice low and resonant with a bitterness that felt ancient. "Of having your identity erased so someone else can write their own narrative over you." He paused, his eyes scanning her face, searching for cracks. "She did this because of me." He explained it then, the cold calculus of corporate warfare, the failed takeover, the bruised ego of a powerful family. He spoke of Vance Industries and a brilliant female CEO he had championed. He laid the motive bare, not as an excuse, but as a confession. It was a message, he concluded, his jaw tight. She couldn't wound me, so she chose to wound someone she thought was mine. Or failing that, someone whose destruction I would be forced to witness. An exercise in cruelty. I am profoundly sorry. The apology hung in the air, heavy and sincere, but Clara couldn't accept it. It wasn't his to give. You didn't do this, she said, her voice flat. She did, and you stopped her. Too late, he countered, a flicker of self-loathing in his eyes. I watched, I analyzed, I waited to be certain. That is my failing, Miss Maeve. I have learned to treat life as a text to be interpreted, not a thing to be lived. My certainty came at the price of your dignity. Jean-Pierre scurried over then, his face a mask of obsequious regret, babbling about her job, a promotion, back pay for her emotional distress. Clara looked at the man, at the gilded room, at the half-eaten plates of food that cost more than her monthly rent. It was a beautiful, elaborate tomb, and she had almost been buried in it. I quit, she said, the words tasting of freedom. She turned and walked away from all of them, through the swinging kitchen doors, past the now sympathetic stares of the staff, and out the service entrance into the cool, damp embrace of the night. She didn't look back. The walk home was a pilgrimage through a city that now felt alien. The familiar streetlight seemed accusatory, the rumble of the late-night bus a monstrous growl. When she finally reached her small apartment, the door opened before she could find her keys. Her grandmother stood there, her face a road map of worry, a worn shawl clutched around her shoulders. She didn't speak. She simply opened her arms, and Clara fell into them, the cold, observant self finally shattering, leaving only the girl who was terrified and trembling, and so tired. She wept until she had nothing left. 2 days passed in a haze of sleep and quiet commiseration. The story was everywhere, a minor scandal that provided a fleeting distraction for the city. Waitress exposes socialite's cruel hoax, the headlines blared. They painted her as a folk hero, a plucky David to Eleanor's Goliath. They got it all wrong. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a bug that had narrowly escaped being crushed under a diamond-studded heel. The victory felt like a violation. On the 3rd day, there was a knock at the door. Not the heavy official knock of the police, but a softer, more hesitant sound. Her grandmother opened it to find Julian Croft standing in the hallway of their modest building. He was dressed not in his severe, dark suit, but in simple grey trousers and a cashmere sweater. He looked smaller without the armour of wealth, more human. He held a simple, unmarked box. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his eyes finding Clara over her grandmother's shoulder. "I came to continue our conversation." They sat in the small, immaculate living room, surrounded by faded photographs and the scent of lemon polish. Her grandmother served him tea in a chipped porcelain cup, her gaze sharp and protective. He did not seem to notice or mind the humble surroundings. He placed the box on the coffee table between them. "I understand if you never want to see me, or anyone from that world again," he began, his fingers steepled before him. "What I have to offer you is not charity. It is not a reward, nor is it an apology. It is a proposition based on mutual need." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was not jewelry, but a beautiful, antique watchmaker's loop. The brass was worn smooth with age, the lens thick and clear. It was her father's, or one just like it. "I bought your father's old shop," Julian said quietly, preempting her shocked question. "The landlord was selling the building. I bought the whole block. The shop is yours again. The inventory, the tools, everything. It will be held in a trust for you. No strings attached. You never have to touch it." "But it's there." Clara stared at the loop, her throat tightening. This was a language she understood far better than money. It was a gesture of profound, startling perception. He had not offered her a fairy tale. He had offered her a piece of her own history, a return to her foundation. "Why?" she whispered. "Because what happened in that restaurant wasn't about a diamond," he said, leaning forward, his voice intense. "It was about the act of seeing. Eleanor Vance tried to make you invisible, to turn you into a caricature, a thief. And you refused. You fought back not with anger, but with observation. You looked closer. You saw the truth in the smallest parts. That skill, that integrity of vision, is rare. It's the rarest thing in the world. And I, Miss Maeve, have a collection of beautiful, expensive lies I desperately need help unraveling." He told her about his art collection, not as a treasure trove, but as a burden, a vast, chaotic mausoleum of objects he had acquired over the years. He spoke of it with a kind of weary sadness. It was a monument to a life of acquisition, not appreciation. "I have paintings that are probably forgeries, sculptures with falsified provenance, artifacts that whisper stories I no longer have the patience to hear. It's a dragon's hoard, and I have forgotten why I gathered it. I don't need a curator to catalogue it. I need a truth-teller. I need someone to look closer. I need your eyes." He named a salary that made her head spin and outlined a full scholarship to any art history and conservation program in the world. But it was his final words that landed. "This isn't a job I'm offering you, Clara," he said, using her first name for the first time. It felt earned. "It's a partnership. You will have complete autonomy. Your task will be to restore the truth to the collection." And in doing so, he hesitated, the mask of the billionaire slipping to reveal a man of profound loneliness. "Perhaps you can help me remember how to see it too." Clara looked from the loop to the man. She saw the trap. The world of wealth was a gilded cage, and this was a very beautiful, very tempting door. But she also saw the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't offering to save her. He was asking her to help save him. The power dynamic had shifted. He was the one in need. "On 3 conditions," she said, her voice finding its strength. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Name them." "1," she said. "I am your employee, not your project. My life is my own." "Agreed." 2. "The first thing we do is establish a foundation. A significant portion of the value of any discoveries, any misattributed masterpieces, any priceless artifacts, will be used to fund legal aid for service industry workers, for people who don't have a Julian Croft watching from table 7. A slow, genuine smile touched Julian's lips. "An excellent idea. Agreed." "And 3, she said, picking up the loop, its familiar weight a comfort in her palm. "You have to learn to use one of these. We're going to look closer. Together." He stared at her for a long moment, and in his eyes, she saw the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. "Agreed, Clara Maeve." Their work began not in a sterile warehouse, but in a dusty, forgotten wing of his city mansion, a suite of rooms he had sealed off years ago. It was here that his first, most personal acquisitions were kept. It was a place of ghosts. Clara, dressed in canvas overalls, her hair tied back, moved through the rooms with a quiet reverence. She taught him the fundamentals: how to handle a canvas, how to analyze brush strokes, the science of pigment, and the poetry of decay. She set up a conservation studio, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil replacing the stale scent of neglect. Their first project was a small, somber portrait of a woman with sad eyes. The inventory listed it as a minor work from the school of a famous painter. It was Julian's mother's favorite. For weeks they studied it. He learned to see the subtle web of craquelure, the faint pentimento, showing the artist had changed the position of the woman's hand. Clara, using infrared reflectography, uncovered the original sketch beneath the paint. It was more confident, more vibrant than the final, somber image. "Someone painted over it," she murmured one afternoon, peering at a monitor. "The final layers. The paint is chemically different. It's from a later period. This painting was altered after the original artist finished it." Together, they pieced together the story through painstaking research. The artist had been the woman's secret lover. The original portrait had been a passionate, joyful rendering. After her death, her husband, Julian's grandfather, a cold and controlling man, had hired a lesser artist to correct it, to paint over the joy with a more socially acceptable melancholy. He had literally painted over her truth. Julian stood before the painting, the revelation washing over him. He was not looking at the canvas. He was looking at his own history, at the inherited sadness and the carefully constructed facades of his own life. "Can you fix it?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Can you bring back what's underneath?" "We can try," Clara said softly. "Restoration is a delicate process. You can't erase the damage. You can only reveal the truth that was always there, and learn to live with the scars." He finally met her gaze, and the understanding that passed between them had nothing to do with art or employment. It was a recognition of two souls engaged in the same delicate work. He reached out and picked up a different tool from the workbench, a fine-tipped cotton swab. "Show me how," Julian Croft said, his voice quiet but clear. "Show me where we begin." And in the quiet of the forgotten room, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of discovery, they began the slow, meticulous work of restoration. It was no longer about a stolen diamond or a ruined evening. It was about two people, a master observer and a master seer, learning to scrape away the layers of varnish and lies, not just on the canvas before them, but within themselves, searching for the brilliant, flawed, and undeniable truth that lay waiting underneath. The work would be long, and it would leave scars. But for the first time in a long time, for both of them, it felt like coming home.